It's important to monitor your learning so you can choose wise strategies, but it is also important to consider the source of your learning. Learning where, when, and from whom you are acquiring a piece of information. As I'm sure you're acutely aware, not all sources are created equally reliable, valid, or trustworthy. Learning source information, which is also called source monitoring, may seem like a very odd part of learning, but it turns out that it matters in all sorts of ways. Consider your knowledge about the way our president is elected in the United States. You know that in the United States, the president is technically elected by the Electoral College, which is composed of representatives from the states who allocate their state's electoral votes, which are in turn based on the number of representatives to the US Congress, to the president, typically wholesale. Now, do you recall when and where you learned this fact? Do you remember who taught you this fact? For most of us, probably not. You just learned this feature of how our government works at some point. Now, for this example, it really doesn't matter where, when, and from whom you learned about the Electoral College, because in fact, that's an accurate description of the Electoral College. But how about this? Imagine that you learn that newly discovered herbal supplements can prevent or treat type 2 diabetes, and this is something South Asians have known for centuries. At this point, it becomes rather critical to remember whether you read this on the website of the Mayo Clinic, a trusted source, or on the website of a company dedicated to selling that particular herbal supplement. In a way, this lecture is about learning information that helps you decide whether other information is worth learning, or how much weight to give other information when pooling information from a lot of different sources to learn about a topic. Source monitoring refers to learning the source and circumstances where we learned a fact or two, along with the fact itself. Some examples of well-known source monitoring tasks include knowing who said what, knowing whether you actually remember seeing something on your now-forgotten shopping list or you just know it was there, knowing whether you actually told your husband about the school play tomorrow or just imagined telling him, and knowing whether you actually saw that driver make an illegal left turn or overheard another witness say that same thing. As you can see, these are judgments we may need to make relatively often, and they all depend on learning the source of a thought, image, or memory, as well as the contents of that memory. Here's the problem. We don't appear as well suited to learning the source of our information as we are for learning the information itself. There are somewhat separate brain circuits involved in learning source information, for example. And many studies show that our memory for the content of information we've learned is superior to our memory for how we learned that content, where, when, and from whom. This divergence in our ability to learn sources versus just information from them first became evident in the context of what is known as the sleeper effect in persuasion. If you're like me, in a few minutes, you're going to find our not-so-fabulous source learning capacity to be pretty disturbing, along with the confirmation bias and naive realism phenomena that we discussed in Lecture 13. So what is the sleeper effect? This goes back to early research on persuasion. Research on persuasion, in contrast to research on learning, is focused on how to change people's beliefs or attitudes towards something. Now, as you might well imagine, this is a kind of research companies and politicians are very interested in because it helps them figure out how to get our money and how to get our votes. In a typical persuasion experiment, you'll be exposed to some kind of argument in favor of a particular position, product, or person. And researchers interested in persuasion then vary pieces of that argument to see what factors make it more or less effective. For example, does it matter if it's a famous actor who is endorsing the politician or a regular Joe the plumber? Are complex, elaborate arguments in favor of a particular policy more effective, or is it better to go with a simple claim? And does the influence of these kinds of issues depend on something else, like characteristics of the audience that you're trying to persuade? Early on in this area of research, people became interested in what was called source credibility. And that's something like this. If your dad, the plumber, tells you about a toilet maintenance miracle product, you might well take his opinion seriously. On the other hand, if your dad, the incompetent, mechanically inept English professor, tells you something similar, a grain of salt, maybe. Here's the catch. Now, immediately after you hear this message, this is exactly how the credibility of a source matters. That is, immediately when you hear a message, if it's your dad the plumber, you say, wow, really? And if it's your dad the English professor, you say, maybe, Dad. Over time, though, somehow that low credibility source message comes to have a stronger effect. That is, over time, it gets more persuasive. Why would this be? Because on the surface of it, it makes no sense at all. And this is what is called the sleeper effect, because it's as though that not very credible message is just sleeping away somewhere in your brain, and then suddenly it pops up as being influential. Now, the explanation for this effect has to do with the fact that we're quite good at learning content, information that's important to our goals and concerns. And often, as we've noted before in this course, we don't really even have to try all that hard to learn that kind of thing. So it's really easy to remember that there exists out there in the world a miracle toilet product that's going to solve all our plumbing issues permanently, forever, fabulous. Unfortunately, we're quite a bit less good at remembering exactly where, when, and from whom we learned about the miracle toilet product. And because of this, the low credibility source information, which was preventing us from taking that idea of the product seriously, fades in time, and it makes space for the message to actually stick around and influence us. There are other really serious issues that our bad source learning ability can raise. One of them is unconscious plagiarism. And this happens when we have a brilliant insight, or worse yet, we come up with a fabulous way to express an idea, and we think the insight or the way of expressing the idea is ours, and in fact it actually belongs to someone else. In a typical study of this kind of phenomenon, you might participate with a group of people, and initially you and all the others would generate ideas about something. Say, one example would be a non-traditional way that you could use a typical object like a paper clip. So what can we do with a paper clip other than clip papers? Now, in this situation, there are two things you are learning. One is ideas about crazy things to do with paper clips. The other is who came up with each idea. Now later, if I'm the experimenter, I can test you both on whether you remember the ideas your group generated and also whether you remember correctly which ideas were yours and which ideas actually came from other group members. From a grading perspective, people do okay at this. They get about a C+. They get about 78% correct judgments of whether ideas were theirs or other people's. But what that means is that they do adopt other people's ideas as their own sometimes. Another issue involves eyewitness memory. And in eyewitness memory research, we can get confused about whether we actually saw something happen when we were eyewitnesses, or whether we just heard about it from other eyewitnesses after the fact. Information from the experience itself, and also from discussing it with other people, reading about it in the news, being interviewed repeatedly about it by people interested in solving a crime, they can all get mixed up in ways that are hard for us to disentangle later because we don't remember which information came from which source. And still another example involves knowing whether we did something or we just imagined it. Say, did we close the garage door or not? This is called reality monitoring, but again, it has to do with whether the source of something you've learned, whether or not you close the garage door, is a real source watching the door come down, or is it just the thought or imagination part of that, where you sort of imagined that you hit the button and then you drove off without actually doing it. These difficulties with source memory have nothing to do with how intelligent we are. Rather, they have a lot to do with the limited nature of our effortful processing systems, of that system 2 for learning. So everyone's vulnerable. And that means we want to ask, what can we do to improve our ability to learn source information? Now, To address this question, let's consider what factors improve or interfere with source learning. And along the way, we'll learn some of the ways that source learning still works quite a bit like other forms of learning. And then we'll return to the issue of which of those factors represent strategies we can actually use in our own lives when we need to do source learning. So first, age is related to source learning in several ways. Young kids are pretty bad at learning the source of their experiences compared to young adults, and older adults are also relatively poor at source learning. For example, in one study, children and young adults were shown 8 smells, or I guess they were asked to really smell 8 smells, by either a male or a female researcher. Later, the kids were tested on whether they had learned the smells, but they were also tested on whether they knew which researcher had presented a smell, the source for that information. Children were significantly poorer at recalling the source than were young adults. This is actually consistent with a lot of similar findings from other studies that look at other kinds of learning and other kinds of sources. Older adults, similarly, show somewhat poor source memory or source monitoring on tasks where they hear statements from 2 different individuals and they're asked later, who said what? And this is also true for tasks where older adults are asked to distinguish between actions they did versus actions they only imagined performing. Now, we really can't do much about being young or old. It is worth knowing, though, that age can put us at an advantage or a disadvantage in terms of learning where, when, and from whom we've learned something, because it lets us know when source is important that we may need to be somewhat more vigilant if we are, for example, entering our later years. Now, a second factor that influences source memory in ways that can both help or hurt us is the use of schemas about a source. We usually have actually pretty well-developed ideas about sources of information, and in fact, this is actually part of what lets us know whether a source is credible or not. And we also have expectations about what others might say or think based on our knowledge of them. So when we're thinking, who said I should read that book? We're likely to use some constructive processes to try to recall based on who we discuss books with, who would like this kind of book, and so on. Because remember, we didn't really quite learn the source in the first place. We want to know who recommended the book because that tells us how much we should seriously consider buying it. You may already be thinking, this type of constructive, expectation-driven way of trying to guess a source is likely to lead to biases. So we're likely to guess that our friend Kate told us about that book when, in this instance, it turns out it was our mother. Here's a funny thing about schemas. When they get violated, that sometimes makes something easier to learn. Something that violates your expectations can actually be easier to recall, provided you were thinking about your expectations in the first place. So, imagine that my mother recommends a science fiction novel to me. Now, in more than 4 decades of my life, this has never happened. So if at that moment I think about the information, the book recommendation, and I pay attention to the source, my mother, the violation of my schema of my mom is likely to make her quite memorable as the source here. Now, of course, I might be more focused on trying to remember the name of the book so that when I'm at the store, I can purchase it. And in that case, I may be less likely to recall the source of the information. So in other words, as with other aspects of learning, when we fail to learn something well enough, we make use of existing knowledge to create an educated guess about that thing. And in the case of sources, our schemas will often be correct, but sometimes they're going to be wrong. Now, remember, we are not going to unlearn schemas. They're actually really helpful, they're really efficient, they do a lot of good work for us. But again, this is a case where this can help us know when source memory matters. One of the things that might lead us astray is our schemas about sources. Now, this example is related to a third factor that influences source learning. And this is a factor that got identified in a meta-analysis of about 72 different experiments on the sleeper effect. In that meta-analysis, researchers first of all confirmed that the sleeper effect exists and it's not trivial. And by that I mean it's pretty sizable as effects go. It actually matters for people's behavior and purchasing decisions and things of that sort. The second thing the meta-analysis showed was that the sleeper effect is very much driven by either failing to fully learn or forgetting the source of information we've acquired. Now, third, and more important for our current thinking, it matters how you process both information about the message, that's kind of the what, that's the content, and information about the source of the message, who's giving you this information. In many cases, it turns out, people apply quite different approaches to these two kinds of information. So if we go back to this book example, when someone recommends a book to you, you often pay most of your attention, the lion's share of your attentional capacity, goes to information about the book. What is it about? Who wrote it? Particularly, what's the title? Where can I get it? Can I get it for the Kindle? Can I get it for the iPad? Is it long? How long is it going to last me? Is it tough to read or is it easy reading? Now, I know that when someone recommends a book to me, I ask a lot of questions about the book. I'm doing elaborative encoding about the book, in fact. And as we know, time and time again, elaborative processing leads to better learning about the book. What have I paid almost no attention to? The source. Now, recall that in my made-up example, the source is my mother, and she's recommending science fiction. If I'm paying a lot of attention to the source, I may really stop and think about that. She doesn't like sci-fi. Does this mean the sci-fi is atypical in some way? Why would Mom like this book when she has utter disdain for the genre? Should I weight her recommendation more heavily because of that? Does that mean this is just an exceptional piece of literature and happens to be sci-fi? Or does it mean this is sci-fi that isn't really good sci-fi, and I should really pay less attention to this recommendation? Now, in most cases, it's more likely that I don't really pay any attention to the source beyond a pretty cursory nod, a kind of look that makes use of what are called heuristic cues about credibility. Now, a heuristic is a rule of thumb, quick and dirty way to go about making a judgment. It's kind of like a good guess, rather than a precise computation or thinking fully through an issue. So in this case, I make kind of a snap judgment about how I'm going to treat source credibility instead of carefully thinking about the meaning of the source for the information they're presenting. So I might think, Mom, not the sci-fi expert, but that's as much thought as I give it. I don't go on to say, well, what does that mean? How should I take that into account? Now, as a result, I might actually initially dismiss this recommendation and I don't buy the book right away. Later, though, I'm wandering around a bookstore, I see that title and I think, oh, right, I heard that was really good, and I buy it. That's the sleeper effect. Now, work on unconscious plagiarism reveals another factor that affects source learning. When you encounter information and think about it yourself, it actually complicates the issue of where a thought came from. So in one study, researchers used an idea generation paradigm, a lot like that example of the paperclip, and they looked at how people come to believe that others' ideas belong to them. Now, as in the standard approach, people first generated ideas in a group setting. But then, people were asked to think about their own and others' ideas more under a variety of conditions. Now, in one condition, people were asked to think about these ideas while adding visual imagery to them. So they're sort of picturing how the paperclip could become a sculpture. And in another, they were asked to just read over the ideas repeatedly. And in still another, they were asked to think about the idea and how it might get improved on. Now, as it turns out, and kind of unfortunately, this last condition makes it more likely that people later think others' ideas were their own, even when the idea really came from a different person. Now, this illustrates a source learning problem, but it also may clarify a number of work-related experiences that many adults have, and maybe some non-work experiences too. So it really is possible that your colleague didn't intend to steal your idea, and honestly believes it was his own. And that may be particularly true if it was generated in a meeting and people discussed how to make your initial idea better. Finally, some researchers point out that there are important clues to source in memory phenomenology, in how it feels to us when we're remembering something. When something actually happened, rather than just being imagined, for example, we tend to remember that event along with all that perceptual and sensory detail that it had when it occurred. And this makes sense because when we go through experiences in our lives, we're paying attention to and we're also learning from the sensations and perceptions that those experiences involve. When we just imagine something, by contrast, we may have memories for our thoughts and feelings, but we also tend to have less of a sense of sensory and perceptual detail. And likewise, if we saw something occur, we tend to have perceptual and sensory memories of that experience, of what we watched. If we read about it, this is less the case. What this line of thinking suggests is that if people are asked to attend to the phenomenological aspects of their memories, to how sensory and perceptual the memory feels, they may actually be better at recalling source information than if they're asked to attend to other aspects of memory phenomenology, like their thoughts and feelings. Thoughts and feelings aren't so good at distinguishing the source that gave rise to them. They all come from inside our heads, and it's hard to know whether they came initially from something outside of us. So we can have powerful thoughts and feelings about imagined events, but it's harder to have very vivid sensory and perceptual memories for things that didn't actually happen. So let's pause for a moment and summarize what all this means for learning source information. First, children and older adults, people over 65 years of age or so, they're more vulnerable to source learning difficulties, and we just can't do much about that beyond knowing it and trying to keep it in mind when it matters. But the other findings provide some more optimistic perspective on improving source learning. Now, first, the findings point to the fact that if we pay attention to source information and we think about what it means, if we elaboratively encode source information, we're able to learn it just fine. So, elaborative encoding includes a variety of features. First of all, it means paying attention to source in the first place when we are learning. Sometimes we can dispense with that when we know we're learning from an authoritative and trustworthy source, but when we don't know that, we need to pay attention to who's telling us information. Now, elaborative encoding also includes thinking about the meaning of the source for the message in a more elaborative way. It means not stopping with, mom, not the sci-fi expert, but kind of going forward and saying, well, how should that affect the message here? How should that affect how I interpret this book recommendation? It also includes paying some attention to sensory and perceptual aspects of the learning experience, sort of what it feels like in the moment while I'm learning. Where am I? What are the sounds? What are the smells? What's the kind of ambiance of the learning situation? These things help us to later remember the source of information. And it's completely possible to become skilled at doing this. Working scientific researchers learn to encode source information all the time. When we learn about new research findings, we typically also learn who generated those findings. Why do we do this? It helps us organize research findings. It helps us keep track of what's going on in a field by knowing what other people's full program of research is about. It helps us keep track of who's doing related research, who are the other experts in our field that we might rely on for advice and suggestions about our own work, and whose work is going to inform our next research project. So source knowledge is actually something that distinguishes experts from novices in many scientific fields, because experts know who's generating knowledge as well as what knowledge is being generated. Well, many of the problems arising from poor source learning extend way beyond simply learning. Knowing whether we did actually lock the door or we just imagined ourselves doing it is not quite learning. And at the end of this lecture, what I want to do is bring all this consideration of source learning and source monitoring back to a consideration of how source learning influences other kinds of learning, more like what we've been thinking about all along in this course. In today's information-rich society, we all learn about topics from many sources. And so issues of source learning become actually quite important for how we integrate different pieces of information into our own full understanding of a phenomenon. In fact, an understanding of sources and an ability to weigh them appropriately can be critical in determining how well people understand something they're trying to learn about, say, on the internet. Consider the example of learning about climate change. In learning about climate change, people might consult a wide variety of sources: news reports from conservative and liberal news outlets, scientific reports, government documents, press releases from universities, blogs on the internet, Wikipedia, popular magazines, textbooks, and so on. There's an enormous wealth of information out there. But to draw conclusions about global warming or climate change across all these different sources, people have to be able to put all the different sources together, and they have to be able to make sense of them. And these different sources are likely to say things that conflict with one another. So people also are going to need to weight the sources appropriately. They're going to need to be able to give less credibility and less weight to information from sources that have obvious conflicts of interest, like oil companies on the one hand, and highly partisan wildlife protection groups on the other. Now, in line with this concern, a set of researchers set out to look at how people learn from multiple documents and multiple sources, and they did actually focus on climate change. The participants read 7 different texts about climate change, obtained from different sources, including a textbook, a popular science text from a university research center, a science article from a research magazine that was authored by a physics professor, a news article from a liberal daily paper, a news article from a conservative daily paper, a Norwegian government report, and an oil company project report. The texts contain conflicting information about causes, consequences, and solutions related to climate change. Participants were tested on their learning by evaluating their comprehension of the materials, and this was done with a series of 25 test sentences that combined information from statements within the text in either valid or invalid ways, and then another 20 test sentences that did the same thing, but instead of combining information within one text, they combined information that was present in different texts. Now, these latter sentences were the critical ones because they're the ones that really address understanding that integrates different sources of information. If we're reading 7 texts about climate change, we don't really want to memorize 7 separate texts. We want to get a general understanding of climate change and the relevant science. So, participants were also tested on their source memory with sentences from the texts and distractor sentences, and they were asked to tell which text the sentence came from. So this is a classic source memory test. Participants whose source memory performance was better also learned more from the texts. And this was true even when the researchers controlled for how much they knew already about climate change and for how much difficulty they had with reading texts. So better source learning was associated with better integration across different sources of knowledge. So source learning is critical for avoiding influence by information we'd rather not learn, advertising from bad sources. It may also foster better capacities to integrate information from multiple sources in a way that takes into account source credibility. There are many circumstances in our everyday lives in which it is important not only to know what we've learned, but also to recall the circumstances under which we learned it, and perhaps especially the source of the information. Now, our tendency is to fail to do so, and this has some predictable consequences. But the findings we've just considered suggest that we can do better, and that doing better improves learning of what we want to know, and may help keep non-credible information buried somewhere out of influential range. In the past 3 lectures, we've considered aspects of how we learn that have to do with dry facts: where, when, from whom, what strategies we employ, and what we know about what we've already learned, and what we're applying with basic cognitive capacities to the act of learning. But part of how we learn also involves how we feel and what we want when we approach learning. And in the next lectures, we'll move to considering these less dry aspects of learning: how what we're feeling affects what we learn, and how what we want to know might do the same.